Joined now by Jennefer Laidley and Desfor, who have edited a really wonderful volume, Reshaping Toronto's Waterfront. It's published by the University of Toronto Press. Jean and Jennefer, thank you so much for coming in on this Thursday to talk about Toronto's waterfront.
Well, thanks for having us. It's great to be here.
What drew you both to the study of Toronto's waterfront, and why undertake an ambitious project like this book at this point in time? Why do it now?
Well, let me start. I've been teaching at York University or I had been teaching at York University for a long time, and one of my first research projects was involved with the waterfront, and that was way back at the end of the 1970s. So ever since then, I have been interested in looking and studying Toronto's waterfront.
And I moved to Toronto from Vancouver about 8 or 9 years ago. That's a big waterfront city, and it's surprising that I didn't really have any interest in the waterfront in Vancouver. But when I came to Toronto, I started working for a city councillor at City Hall who had a big chunk of the eastern edge of the central waterfront in her ward, and so I was responsible for a lot of the liaison there. So that got me very interested. And when I went back to do my master's degree at York, which is where I met Jean, I ended up doing my master's work pretty much exclusively focused on Toronto's waterfront.
Yeah, and the immediate impetus, I guess, for this book was a Social Science and Humanities Research Council funded research project, and that was called Changing Toronto's Waterfront, and we got that project in 2005, I believe, and it was a multidisciplinary project, a number of researchers, a number of institutions, and one of the outcomes of that big research project was this book.
Well, wonderful, and the book is Reshaping Toronto's Waterfront, and right in the introduction, and I'll admit I said this, but your introduction said that there are people out there with a popular sentiment that there is a knot of outdated politics that have tied up change on Toronto's waterfront. And I'll admit I was one of those people. I was one of those people who sort of looked at the waterfront and thought, why can't we get anything going there? But you actually say that the last 100 years in particular have been a time of constant change on Toronto's waterfront. What sort of, when you look at the waterfront, unlike when I look at it, what constant change do you see on the waterfront over our last 100 years?
Yeah, well, first we need to say that we're considering this time span 150 years, and most people who are think about when the change on the waterfront, think about it in the last 6 months, maybe the last year or two, and so we're taking a much longer time span. And in that 150 years, our research found that things were constantly changing. And when we say things are constantly changing, we're not only looking at the physical landscape or the physical shape of the waterfront, but we're also talking about the way the waterfront is governed, the way it's regulated, the kind of activities that people think should be on the waterfront, relations between the natural and the social environments. So we are looking at much more than just the physical shape of the waterfront. And when we use the word reshaping in the title of our book, that's exactly what we are trying to convey, that it's both the physical aspects of the waterfront and changing aspects of the physical aspects of the waterfront, but also the way it's governed in the environment, and particularly processes by which those things happen. So that's very much concerned with the economics and the politics of waterfront change. So, for example, in terms of the governance of the waterfront, the things that we see that are changing. One of the major issues was the establishment of the Toronto Harbor Commission. We'll talk more about this later, I presume. But that happened in 1911. And that brought about a very, very fundamental change to what was happening on the waterfront. and particularly in terms of the physical aspects, but also the way it was governed in the environment. And that's carried over to with the Port Authority.
And just to pick up, you mentioned environmental decisions there, and I certainly noticed as I moved through the different papers in the book that a constant theme of many of the authors is exactly that environmental and ecological decisions and other decisions made in the past have such a huge impact on the choices that are even available to us moving forward in a way that we maybe normally don't think about. And you point to, very early in the book, the flood protection berm that's is now completed, but was being built in the West Don lands at great expense, and how that actually is a direct result of the old decisions made maybe not with a complete ecological understanding, but the decision to straighten the Don River. And you say that that's it particularly shows how interconnected urban life and ecological processes are. But I wondered if you could expand on that for us a bit, because often when we think of ecology, or at least in my layman's sense, when I think of ecology, I think of Algonquin Park, and I fail to think of downtown and an urban center. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about that, and particularly how those past changes or past decisions have constrained our future options.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. First we want to say that we're not wholly deterministic about this. I mean, it's not as though past decisions necessarily determine exactly what's going to happen, but they certainly have a big influence on our choices. So let's just talk a little bit about the lower Don River for a minute, just to give folks an idea of what we're talking about. So before the 1880s, the lower Don looked pretty much like any other river delta that you might see. It was a meandering river through the valley, and it changed course as it went along, and it opened up into a big marsh, Ashbridges Bay and Marsh. And in the late 1800s, the railroads wanted land for an eastern entrance into the city. So this massive engineering project was undertaken to straighten the Don, ran for about a decade. And what they did was they basically encased the river in concrete and channelized it to give it a straighter course and to create what I like to call territorial certainty. Everybody knew where the river was and where the land was. So that's an example of shaping the river for urban purposes. But as a result of straightening the Don, the river's ecological functions were compromised in terms of its ability to accommodate rising water levels. So in 1954, we saw with Hurricane Hazel that hit the city and dumped 11 inches of water in something like 36 hours and killed 81 people and left 1,800 people homeless. It became clear after that storm that the area around the mouth of the Don had to be protected from such situations, so future flooding situations. So the city eventually passed a zoning regulation that was called a holding bylaw that says that nothing was supposed to be built on the Don floodplain until measures were taken to resolve what would be a sort of once-in-a-century flooding threat. And you'll see in some of the planning documents that the flooding threat is not just about the West Don lands, it's also about the entire downtown. So unless the flooding threat from the Don River is resolved, much of the downtown is in jeopardy. So they decided to build a flood protection berm in the West Don lands. That's a direct response to this threat of flooding. And as a result of the berm, as a result of resolving the flooding threat, a whole bunch of new development opportunities are opening up. So the West Don lands is slated to, they're going to be building 5,800 residential units, and there's going to be something like 90,000 square meters of commercial space. So we see that urban activities in both the 19th and the 21st centuries are directly linked with ecological processes. In the first instance, we needed to straighten the Don River in order to get the railroads into the city. In the latter case, we need a berm to protect from the results of that straightening.
Certainly, and the Don, I think we can't talk about Toronto's waterfront and the harbor without talking about the Don River. And not only the berm, but as part of the development that's going on there is a push, and not just part of it, but to renaturalize some portions of the lower Don and to undo some of those past changes. And when I was reading the work in the book about that, there was a phrase that was used called socio-nature. What does that phrase mean in this context of making changes and then going back to undo the changes we've made?
Yeah, it's an awkward phrase, and maybe we didn't really want to use that word, but we couldn't find something else that captured the meaning that we wanted. And so, yes, it is awkward and unfamiliar language, but we think it's important. And what it means is, let me start with nature, the word nature by itself. And nature is really one of the most complex words in the English language. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Some people think it has some connection with divine intervention or divine control. Others think about it as nature being out there in Algonquin Park, something outside the control of human beings. But it has lots of when meanings to people. So when we add on this idea of nature, not only is so when we add on the idea of society, not only is nature complicated, but then putting on society to it makes it even more complex. But fundamentally, what we're arguing in the book is that society and nature, that is, human-made objects and nature, have been combined in such a way that it's virtually impossible to distinguish one from the other. And the fate of one, the fate of society or the fate of nature, is greatly influenced by the fate of the other. So one of the classic examples of nature society is Dolly the sheep. I'm suppose that many of your listeners have heard of Dolly the sheep, right? This is a classic example of that inseparability. Is Dolly natural? Well, maybe in some aspects it is. Is she man-made or human-made? For sure in some aspects. Dolly looks like a sheep, and in many ways she acts like a sheep. But in many ways she's not what we think of being as natural. And indeed, she's not natural in that one aspect, one meaning of the word. If we think about all the research that went into the creation of Dolly and all the funding that was required for that research, all the brain power that went into creating that knowledge, and all the political decisions that made that funding possible, so that the consequences that emerge from those funding decisions are what we call embedded or integral to what we see as Dolly the sheep. So we see Dolly as an example of how society and nature are really inseparably combined. And that's what we call socio-nature. The Don River is just one example of that. So that the Don was a deltaic, curving a river that curved back and forth. It was straightened. So we have a situation which is both natural and human-made.
Thank you for that explanation, and I think it is important, I guess, to remember, particularly when we talk about something like Toronto's harbor, where there are forces of nature. They're influenced at every turn by, as we've said, the decisions of the past. I want to turn now to something, Jean, that you mentioned earlier, and that's the Toronto Harbor Commission, which was actually founded by federal legislation in 1911. And I guess we should start right at the beginning. That the Toronto port had been there for a long time before the Harbor Commission was established, from as early as 1793, when it was really established because of the military value of our harbor. Mm-hmm. So how had that harbor been managed up until this big change in 1911 to the Harbor Commission?
Well, starting in about 1850 or so, the harbor was managed by a provincially legislated board called the Commissioners. There's a lot of commissioners involved in the waterfront. The Commissioners of the Harbor of Toronto, which is not the same as the Harbor Commission. And people commonly called that the Harbor Trust. And there were 5 commissioners, and it gets into the issues of governance. 2 of the commissioners were nominated by City Council, 2 by the Toronto Board of Trade, which is, of course, very interesting because they had interests in shipping and maintaining the port and the harbour, and 1 by the provincial government. The Harbour Trust was given the responsibility in that provincial legislation to maintain the port and the harbour and to make plans for development of the port and the harbour. But there were big problems with the Harbour Trust, mostly because of its inability to raise funds for harbour development and because there were accusations of rampant corruption with the Harbour Trust. So that's what led to a lot of discontent and eventually the creation of the Harbour Commissioners.
And so 1911, the Harbour Commission is founded. And that actually leads very directly to the radical alteration of the physical waterfront. I think Michael Redhill, in his novel, which is also referred to in the book, but calls the process the city walking on water. Why was it that this change in the form of governance actually fundamentally changed the actual contours of the harbor? What happened there?
Yeah, well, let me talk a little bit about why the Harbor Commission was established and what went on, and just to give some kind of a background. In the end of the or towards the end of the 1800s, the 19th century, and continuing into the beginning of the 20th century, there were a lot of struggles, political struggles primarily, to alter the Harbor Trust and to establish some kind of a new organization that would govern the port and harbor developments. And finally, then in 1911, the Toronto Harbor Commission was established as a federal body. And this changed things dramatically on the waterfront, and it changed it dramatically in what I'll just enumerate as 4 basic ways. First, it was a commission, a commissioned government that was outside of the normal functioning of city or federal government structures. And it was intended to operate in a business-like fashion. That was the first characteristic of the Harbor Commission. The second one was it had the powers to raise funds by issuing bonds, which the Harbor Trust didn't have that power, and it also had the ability to take land through the powers of eminent domain. The third aspect was that the federal body was, and this was a crucial kind of compromise, although it was a federal body, 3 of the members of its 5 board member were representatives of the city of Toronto, so that the majority of the board of that Harbor Commission were nominated or represented the city of Toronto. And the 4th basic way that the Harbor Commission changed planning and development, that it was given ownership of virtually all of the waterfront. The city's lands were sold to the Harbor Commission for a nominal sum of about $1, and this gave the Harbor Commission power and the land to do an awful lot with the waterfront.
And I'm a bit of a map junkie, and your book is full of great maps and graphics. But it really, to me, was just shocking to look at the shoreline sort of pre-1911 and then today's shoreline, how very, very different it is. And how did that come to be? I mean, why was it that, again, as you've explained, there is this fundamental change in governance and ownership, but yet when you look at the maps, wow, is it a
Right.
differently shaped harbor?
Right. Well, the Harbor Commission, after it was established in 1911, and there were a lot of battles that preceded its establishment and gave it a lot of impetus to do something. So only 6 months after it was established, it came forward with this plan, the 1912 Waterfront Development Plan, and that plan was responsible for changing the physical shape of the waterfront beyond anything that's happened since. And from that plan, the port lands, which it's about 1,000 acres of land at Cherry Beach. The Leslie Street Spit comes off of that. The Hearn Generating Station is out there. All that was created by filling in Ashbridges Bay. And today, about 85% of the central waterfront used to be the bottom of Lake Ontario. It was filled in. Lake Ontario was filled in to create lots of the central waterfront, and that all came about because of that 1912 waterfront plan.
Yeah, people might wonder why Front Street is called Front Street. Well, it used to be the front of the city. Basically everything, just about everything south of Front Street it used to be the lake, and is now part of the city.
Yeah. So one of the big things that happened was the filling in of Ashbridges Bay and Marsh, which we'll get to in a bit later. But that was a major aspect of that 1912 plan, and that's where the Port Industrial District, what we now call the Portlands, was created.
Well, and why don't we jump right there, because it did surprise me. I mean, in reading the book, how eager engineers and people in the city had been to fill in Ashbridges Bay. I noted as early as 1853 there were some people advocating it, and this becomes official in that 1912 plan. But why do you think that was, that there was such an eagerness to fill in Ashbridges Bay? That then ultimately the harbor commissioners acted on, not only to create the land, but to fill in the bay as well.
Yeah, well, I think that the eagerness to fill in the bay evolved over a number of years and even a number of decades. And there, as you mentioned, there was talk of it as far back as 1853, and why that was there was a vision in Toronto. There was a public agenda that Toronto's future lay in industrialization. And there were a lot of efforts to industrialize the city. And there was a perception that there was a need for more industrial lands. And so where would those industrial lands come from? Well, filling in Ashbridges Bay seemed to be the answer to that. That was one of the reasons. The second reason was that the railroads had been monopolizing transportation facilities, and there was, as a result of that, there was what were seen to be unfair prices, monopoly prices, so there was insufficient competition with shipping, and so that the Harbor Commission wanted to change things and get more competition and encourage shipping, so there would be competition with the railways. And the third final reason that there was so much interest in filling in Ashbridges Bay was a variety of health concerns. And people feared the bay, and there wasn't really a great scientific understanding of the source of diseases, but they thought that this unhealthy, foul-smelling, and what was called cesspool-like area was the source of cholera and typhoid. So for all those three reasons, there was really a great wish to fill in Ashbridges Bay, and it was thought to be a useless area. So,
and again, it comes back that theme of sort of an incomplete ecological understanding,
yes,
which of course it's easy to look back and say they didn't have a complete understanding. I think often people will look back at us and say the exact same thing, but.
Yeah, but now we are beginning to understand the importance of marsh areas, and we see, for example, in lots of places in the city, that man-made marsh areas are being constructed, like Chester Springs Marsh, for example.
Well, and that takes me directly to the next question I wanted to ask, which is that they didn't have, or particularly I think when a lot of those decisions were made, an adequate appreciation maybe of the ecological factors at play. But you have both studied this for a long, long time. In your view, looking at this period of time where the harbor commissioners, this long period of time where the harbor commissioners were governing the harbor, what do you think were the worst ecological decisions, and what were the best ecological decisions that were made by that group?
Well, I think that Gene and I both agree that probably the worst ecological decision was filling in Ashbridges Bay, despite the fact that it had become, as Gene said, thought of as a cesspool, and that nasty. There was a bunch of nasty business going on in there because people were tossing their garbage and their the refuse from cattle buyers and all kinds of nasty things.
The Gooderham and Worts had established a cattle buyers or barns that the cattle fed on the byproduct of corn being used for the brewing process, and they would feed that corn to the cattle, and the cattle would.
And the end product of that process was deposited in the bay, unfortunately.
Yes, and so it was quite smelly.
Yeah, but nonetheless, I mean, there are other options to resolving those kinds of problems than simply, dumping 1,000 square meters of how much is it?
1,000 acres.
1,000 acres, sorry, of land into the marsh in order to get rid of it. Would be the construction of the Leslie Street Spit, which, unlike the Port Industrial District, came about largely accidentally. The spit was kind of seen as a garbage dump in much the same way that the marsh had been, and for many years was just a place that the detritus of development was being dumped. And nature, well, it's tough to talk about nature in this context, but nature sort of took over. The spit is now, recognized as a very important place in the flyway for a lot of bird species. There's a lot of animals that live down there. The butterflies do their migration through the Leslie Street Spit. And so that may have been one of the best decisions, even though it was kind of an accidental one.
And I guess that takes us, I wanted to talk a bit about the legacy of the harbor commissioners, and I think the thing that's striking, because you talk about the poorness of the decision to fill in Ashbridges Bay, but the Harbor Commission had this unique dual role that Gene was telling us about, where they actually had control of the land and were a land developer on the one hand and were a manager of the harbor on the other hand, and of course that created a great incentive to create land that they could then manage. But given that dual and at sometimes conflicting role, what was the major legacy, in your view, that comes out of the Harbor Commission period and that tension between those roles?
I think that it's probably that a lot of tension, it's interesting that you use that word, that a lot of tension was created because they took on the role of land developer much more than the role of port and harbor minding body. Because the Commission operated as a land development agency, not only in terms of building new land, but also in terms of managing, leasing, selling off that land, and not particularly paying much attention to what other players in the urban development world were interested in. The city, for example, local residents, the provincial government. Relations with local residents and the city in particular were pretty tense for many, many years. And so, that sort of contentiousness that was built up over many years because of the Harbor Commission's taking on that land development role has really carried on to the present day, particularly in terms of, people will remember the big fight between the City of Toronto and the Port Authority over the Island Airport, for example.
Certainly that legacy of contentiousness does seem to exist with the Port Authority. And it was funny to me, one of the papers in the book talks about the public debates that were going on in the newspapers and in the public realm at the commission of the creation of the Harbor Commission. And to me, I could have been reading it about that debate over the Island Airport Bridge. The Toronto Board of Trade was on one side saying it's got to be outside city government so that the profits go back into the harbor, and this is vital to the health of the city, that it doesn't get sort of siphoned away. And of course, people on the other side saying, well, this is a scheme that really only benefits the business community and it doesn't benefit the general public. And I had this incredible sense of deja vu, and I wonder, as you have studied so in such detail the last 150 years, that sense must be very powerful for you. Are there any new arguments on the waterfront, or are we having the same conversation again and again and again?
Well, I'm always just like you. I'm always struck by the similarities in the debates between the present time and the past. And, it's not really surprising that we keep on having the same debates, because the fundamental struggle, despite the fact that there's been a whole lot of change over the last 100 years, not only in terms of the waterfront's physical shape and governance structures, but also, on a bigger scale, economic activities have changed, technologies have changed. But, the fundamental struggle is really not that much different. And that's because the struggle is about who gets to decide, who gets the benefits of development. That's kind of the base of a lot of questions of urban development, whether in Toronto, on the waterfront, in other areas, or, in many other places in the world. One of the examples of that is that at the beginning of the 20th century, the most profitable use of land was for industrial purposes. So there was a big push to create industrial land. But in the contemporary period, the most profitable land is this mix of residential, commercial, recreational, and entertainment. So there's that tension that happens. There's also a lot of, other people have a lot of other ideas about what the waterfront should be used for. It shouldn't necessarily be about what's the most profitable use of the land, many people think. So
yeah, I think that the contemporary period can be characterized by the great number of people and organizations who want to have something to say about what happens on the waterfront. Because the waterfront is a very, very special place in the city, and a lot of people want to have access to it, to use it for all kinds of things, and they get organized and they attempt to have some influence on what goes on there.
It kind of gets back to that debate, the timeless debate about what is the public good.
It really gets to the very, very heart of that debate, I think, in a concrete way. Just to
concrete might be a
yeah, that might be an unfortunate
no, that was good
choice of words. Just to bring the story up to date, of course, we no longer have the Harbor Commission. We now have the Port Authority. In your view, how does the Port Authority compare? Is this a very similar organization, or is there actually something fundamentally different about the shift from the Harbor Commission to the Toronto Port Authority?
Yeah, well, the Port Authority, which was created about 1993, it is really much diminished port and a harbor minding body over the Harbor Commission. Following David Crombie's Royal Commission, the Harbor Commission was stripped of most of its power, a lot of its land development powers, and a lot of its land. So that now the Port Authority is governed by a board that is composed primarily of port users rather than city representatives. And the primary function of the Port Authority is take care of the port and the harbor. The port is underwater, and the harbor is underwater, and the port is the land. And they have control or management functions for the island airport and for the outer harbor marina, but that they have very little land development responsibilities.
That's all been pretty much given over to the Waterfront Toronto, what used to be the Toronto Waterfront Revitalization Corporation.